Hello, everyone. Welcome to this joint research panel sponsored by the ACRL Educational and Behavioral Sciences Services Research Committee and the ACRL EBSS Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Committee. Thank you so much for attending. Our thoughts and prayers go to those who are dealing with hurricanes and COVID this week. Thank you all so much for coming. And in this session today, we'll have three panelists joining us who will talk briefly about their experiences doing diversity-focused research. Then we will have a lot of time left over for questions and answers. So you can pose questions to any of our panelists or to all of our panelists about any issue that you can think of related to diversity research. And I'm going to take us into the slideshow. Our purpose then of today's panel is to help you gain deeper knowledge about how to thoughtfully conduct social justice research and learn about strategies to be more inclusive in your research processes. We'll start off, as I mentioned, with an introduction of our panelists, brief presentations by our panelists, maybe 10 to 15 minutes for each panelist, then a question and answer session, followed by a conclusion. So here are our three panelists: J.J. Pianke, James W. Rosenzweig, and Marco Seiferli Valencia. JJ will be our first panelist to speak today. JJ is an instructor of information for Syracuse University, where he teaches the Disability and Accessibility course. He is an award-winning librarian who is known for his work on disability and accessibility for patrons and employees. When he is not advocating for embracing accessibility within the profession, he can be found reading, needle pointing, and video gaming while his two Maine Coons nap nearby. So JJ, I'll now turn it over to you for an overview of your research.
All right, thank you very much. And let's just go to the next slide. All right, so I took the research part to be quite literal. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about my research in particular, because that's what I know, but also like what is sort of the most common in disability research. And I'm going to preface this little conversation or presentation with, all this work came out of, marching down the track towards tenure. So I did I did all of this work as I was moving towards tenure. I didn't get tenure, and there are many reasons for that had nothing to do with the work that I produced. But when we think about disability, we think about diversity, DEIA, DEIJ, and pick your acronym here. Either I think a lot of people either go, full hog or they go piecemeal. And at least being on the tenure track, I went full hog. And part of that was because I did take the National Center for Faculty Diversity and Development and Diversity. I never remember. I took their boot camp, and that was really great for me because it said to me, pick a topic and aim everything in that direction. So that was what I did. I picked disability. All of my research was on disability. All of my committee appointments were either diversity, DEI, or disability. And that helped significantly. So if you're going to go full in on DEI, pick some aspect of DEI that calls to you and go full in, right? Make it part of every aspect of your day. which is exactly what I did. So when I came into this work about 10 years ago, it was a lot of interview studies with other librarians about people with disabilities. So, as a researcher, I might go up to Brett and say, hey, as a director of a library, what are you doing for people with disabilities? So I'm talking to other librarians, but I'm not talking to people that actually have disabilities. And there's quite a few studies that are like that, especially about 10 years ago when I started. There was also quite a few studies that were case studies. We did this one thing with this one patron and it worked well, it didn't work well. This is what we learned. Nothing wrong with that, but it was a lot of one-offs. And then finally, there was a lot of emphasis on electronic accessibility, and there still is. Within the literature seems to break apart into like two pieces: electronic accessibility and physical accessibility. And we tend to lose sight of invisible disabilities, as well as like mental health disabilities, and more importantly, accommodations, right? So scanning the literature tells us where are the gaps, what's not being talked about. So if you're starting on a research agenda, scanning the literature and understanding what's there and what's missing can help inform what you're going to do with your research. Next slide, please. So for me, these were some of my methods. My favorite were interviews, focus groups, and oral histories, because disability is a very nuanced issue. And people with disabilities really smash into ableism and the medical model of disability a lot, right? The medical model of disability basically focuses on, well, if you just rest enough, take your medication, go to therapy, have this surgery, you'll be fine, right? You'll be fixed. And that manifests in a very large variety of ways. So for instance, the expectation that if, I, the library employer, give you an accommodation for a standing desk, you'll never need another accommodation. That's ableist and also adhering to the medical model. Why? Because we know that if you have a permanent disability, generally speaking, it's not going to get better, right? It's going to get worse over time. And that's a major issue where a single accommodation is not going to work for the entire 20 years you're at that position, right? So that's really hard that information is really hard to grab in a survey, unless you're expecting people to fill out a survey question, which most people don't want to do. So interviews, focus groups, and oral histories, I think, tend to be, my favorite methods for my topic. These are all examples that I've done that you can find on the internet, right? The survey is really overused. I've used them myself. I had, a learning curve with how to use them. They tend to be, when they're done well, you can get great information from them. Most of the time, they're not done well. And the issues with surveys are they weren't proofread well enough, they weren't test driven by a potential participant, to say like, well, this doesn't make any sense, or they're not detailed enough. Question 1 says, pick one item. Question 2 doesn't have any instructions at all. Do I pick one item or do I pick 5 items? And so being consistent is something hard to remember. It has to be very detailed. And a lot of us don't have that background in survey design and how to create questions that get exactly what you're looking for. So yeah. One of the things I actually really like a lot, and that makes people uncomfortable, is textual analysis. I find this to be very underused. And the reason I like it and the reason people find it uncomfortable is because this is reflective of the profession. So I might look at a body of literature and look at, well, how are we referring to people with mental health disabilities? Are we saying things like deal with, problem patron, right? How we refer to people who have mental health disabilities really says more about us than about them, right? So when we say deal with or problem patron, which comes up in the literature a lot, we have a negative view of somebody within a mental health crisis, right? Or is having a mental health issue. And to me, that indicates, oh, we got work to do, right? We need to do mental health first aid. We need to do other types of training, and so on and so forth. So, I haven't seen a lot of textual analysis that's reflective of the profession on any topic. I've done a little bit. My first master's degree is English literature, so I have a bit of a background in that. Um, and I find it kind of disturbing that we as a profession don't spend more time in self-reflection. Next slide, please. So, hot topics and pitfalls. We'll go with the pitfalls first. Interviewing other librarians about what they want to do about disabilities. Like that's can be interesting, depending on what questions you're asking. Like if you're asking, what policies are library administrators putting into place around the use of mechanized mobility devices in the library, right? You may say like, well, that's kind of a no-brainer, isn't it? And maybe not necessarily. Like, yes, we're going to allow mechanized wheelchairs, but one of the things on campuses has been those like mechanized scooter skateboard things. And as a person with disabilities, that thing would not work for me because of my size. But like if I was a normal size, that would actually probably be a really good device for me. I wouldn't have to be in a wheelchair. I could still get around. I do have limited mobility because of busted up knees and ankles. Um, but using one of those to get around is less of a footprint and can get me into more places than using mechanized wheelchair that is like the size of a table, right? So, a lot of university policies are like, no, you can't have those on campus. And so that's something to think about in terms of our policies. Sometimes our policies are written in a way that actually prevent motorized wheelchairs from being in the library, technically. Now, we usually just ignore it, but if it's going to be a policy, it should be worded correctly. Um, so yeah, so other pitfalls, adhering to the medical model of disability. How do we do accommodations so that we don't interrupt performance? Well, accommodations are meant to enhance performance so that people with disabilities can perform at the same level as a person without disabilities. So how are we enhancing performance? Things like that. So you have to watch your verbiage and how you're thinking about people with disabilities. And this is true for any DEI topic, right? Hot topics in my area, employees with disabilities, big topic coming up. Lots and lots of discussion about the accommodation process, about how do we support people with disabilities in the job, in the interview process. How do we retain? We're starting to see much more discussion about retaining DEI folks rather than just recruitment. And this is huge because, you know, the profession has been very DEI focused for 20 years, but it's been for performative. It hasn't actually been, we're going to recruit and retain. If I had a buck for every time, you know, a person I know who is DEI has left the profession because of how they've been treated, I could have a really expensive steak dinner. Like, that's not something to brag about, profession. We need to do better. Asking people with actual disabilities what they want and what they need is a big one, and the answers will surprise you. And then calling out the rampant ableism within the profession, and it is rampant. There's a lot of ableism in this profession, both in regards to how we treat patrons and how we treat employees, as well as talking about ADA compliance versus accessibility. ADA compliance is the floor. Why are we proud of that? We should be accessible, not just compliant. I have strong feelings. I'm sure you can tell. So my 10 minutes are up. I'm going to stop there and let the next person go. But I'm happy to talk about my topic and about the research I've done, either in this webinar or pop me an email, because obviously I love, you know, this research, and I will talk your ear off. Next.
Thank you so much, JJ. That was wonderfully insightful and soul searching. Really great. And now we'll turn to James, who is the Education and Children's Study Librarian at Eastern Washington University. He has worked as an academic librarian for over 13 years. His research interest in LGBTQIA plus inclusion in children's literature, in innovative source evaluation models, and in the history of indigenous boarding schools in the United States all converge on the central importance of elevating marginalized voices in every area of academia and society at large. So I'll now toss it over to you, James.
Thanks so much, Brett, and what a delight it is to be here with you all. If we can go ahead to the next slide, which I think is probably just my name, and we can actually move beyond that to the next slide. Yeah, it was wonderful to be asked to be here and to reflect on the ways in which my work has engaged with EDI over the years. So just to say a little more about each of those projects that Brett just alluded to, one of my really active projects right now, I'm working with two wonderful collaborators, Alicia Vandering at the University of Rhode Island and Amanda Malili at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. The three of us have been working on the Rainbow Representation Rubric, which is an analysis of LGBTQIA+ representation in children's picture books over the last 10 to 15 years, building the rubric and a glossary, starting to try and analyze trends and to understand what that representation looks like at a time when the national environment of challenges and bans to that material is really urgent. And JJ, your wonderful presentation reminded me of the importance of putting our attention on ourselves, that one of the things we have done with that work is to start to compare our data with the kind of language used by our cataloging data in library catalogs, and also the language used by book reviewers, which of course is a mixture of librarians and some of our fellow academics, but that was really interesting work, is really interesting work. Separately, for about a decade now, I've been at work on this source evaluation model, the Y method. My primary collaborator that whole time has been Mary Till at Northeastern Illinois University in Chicago, and we've had a number of other wonderful folks with us along the way in different phases of the project. The goal of the Y method is to create a broader, more inclusive source evaluation method that we can use to analyze student research bibliographies, but we can also teach them an instruction that they can use to analyze sources for themselves. And I'll say a little more about this in just a moment, but one of the things that has been really important to us is making sure that that method is expansive in the ways that it thinks about authority, that it is much more responsive than our sort of traditional approaches in libraries, to being welcoming to marginalized voices, folks speaking to us from marginalized communities that don't always have access to the same publishing platforms that some of our more traditional sources come from. Both of those are projects I've been working at for years. You may well have encountered presentations or publications in different venues, which would be great if so. The last one is a project I've never been able to mention before because I'm still in early phases here. It's just been the last couple of years that I've been working with a historian and Native Studies scholar at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, Dr. Matt Villeneuve, doing this research. Dr. Villeneuve's great-grandfather was one of the students pushed onto an indigenous boarding school in western Minnesota, in Morris, Minnesota. And so I've been using my library skills in new ways, helping him access different resources and pull together the kinds of scholarly material he needs to be able to tell the stories, not just of the school as an institution, but of the people, the Native people themselves, their experiences, not just at the school, but afterwards, and the really full lives that many of them went on to live. So each of those has been really rewarding project to work on, and all of them have some connection here to EDI. Can we go to the next slide? So the panel posed some really thought-provoking questions, inviting us as panelists to try and answer them. I'm going to try and get to 3 of them here before my time runs out. First of all, what brought me here? Well, the oldest of these 3 projects is this work I've been doing with Mary Till on the Y method. And Mary and I, when we started talking about source evaluation and wanting to design something that would work better for the research we were doing, we had this realization early on that for our careers and for the careers of lots of other people we know, we as academic librarians emphasize students using peer-reviewed academic journals, using the kinds of more scholarly publications are on our library shelves. And there are some reasons for that. There's some important reliability measures built in there. There's probably some self-preservation there. We want people to use our stuff to remind them how useful we are, but they need libraries still. But there was this sort of unintended but serious consequence that we were not really moving people into higher education publishing and therefore away from all of the voices that don't have much access to that space. But we know that folks from marginalized communities often don't have the same access to even getting into postgraduate education. They often do not have the same support networks or supportive mentors that allow them to successfully complete those programs, find secure employment that allows them to publish. And so telling students, hey, use these higher ed approved publication venues only, or at least think of them as the best or the most accurate, pushes people away from all of the other places they might encounter really wise and insightful experience from voices that don't get much access to that space. So that is what got me started thinking about this, and that's been an important driving factor for Mary and I for years now. As far as how I got to be involved in doing work on LGBTQIA+ representation, the folks at Diverse Bookfinder, if you know that project, starting up at Bates College, and now they have collaborators elsewhere, it led me to conduct a diversity audit of my collection because their work focuses on race and ethnicity. And I learned so much from that audit that it made me say, well, what are all the other axes of diversity I haven't learned about or haven't thought about? And among them, I decided, well, I really want to do some work on LGBTQ plus representation and inclusion. I want to learn more about that. And I was just super fortunate that I was reaching those conclusions and thoughts at the same time that Alicia Vandering in Rhode Island and Amanda Malilly at UNLV were on their own paths toward that work. And the 3 of us found each other because it's been incredibly rewarding. And the work I've been doing with this historian and Native Studies scholar, it's just what brought me here was connection. And I think it's important for us to remember that so much of this depends on networking and building connections with people, especially outside of libraries. This was a case where he might never have asked questions of a librarian that he asked of me because we're friends. And I might never have volunteered things to a member of the history faculty here that I volunteered to him about ways I might approach things or resources I might access. That led to us working together, and it's been really incredibly fruitful, all 3 of these projects. On the next slide, please. One of the questions we were posed was about intersectionality and how to build intersectionality into your work, which is super important. I think being really conscious on building on good work that came before you is a great way of doing that. I know that our work on the rainbow representation rubric is in good conversation with work on race and ethnicity in children's books, in part because we're building on top of work being done by Diverse Book Finder and by the Cooperative Children's Book Center at UW-Madison, because they've been engaged in that work for a long time. The work we're doing on the Y method was built on top of research done at Michigan by leader Markeen Yekel that was engaged in some of these same conversations, but in different ways. And I think it made us mindful from the very beginning of how to be thoughtful in asking good intersectional questions. But I think another piece that's so important, and I would assume that JJ and Marco would agree, like you get good intersectionality if you can get a good research team together. I've been so lucky. The research teams I've mentioned here in these last few minutes, each of them is diverse along different axes. And it's important to remember that your work isn't done by building a team of diverse folks to work with. If you're not able to be honest with each other and to be vulnerable with each other, people aren't going to bring their experience to that space. And that's an intimidating thing in a research meeting, to speak up and say, hey, I think we're missing something, especially if what you're pointing out is something that you know from an experience of marginalization. And so it's important to hold that space for each other and to build that kind of space with each other that lets people share their experience in thoughtful ways. That's work that takes time. I was really lucky with all of these teams that these were folks that I had worked with either personally or professionally previously. I had an existing relationship to start from. And I know that we've done better and better work the more we've gotten to know and trust each other, because then it allows you to bring those other experiences into that research conversation. And then the next slide, please. Lastly, this question about what topics are hot, man, there's so much work that I would be delighted to see going on out there. And so here's just a thought apiece for each of the different areas that I have an interest in and that I've been doing some work in. When I finished my diversity audit and settled on working on LGBTQIA+ representation, I had lots of other things written down on my page of different areas I wanted to get a better understanding. Ability and disability in children's literature and the representation there, representation of socioeconomic class in children's books. I'm hoping there is research out there on this already that folks are doing, and I just don't know it yet. I'd love to read it. If it's not, though, I think it's an important time for us to be engaged in what children's books say to and do for children, because there's so much pressure on them right now. We need to make the case for what they do. The work that Mary and I have been doing to try and understand how to teach students about source evaluation is great, but it only goes so far to tell them they can use marginalized voices speaking outside of the sphere of academia. What is going to lead students to do that? That kind of research, that kind of understanding of the student research experience, I think is really important. I think it's probably also challenging, again, because that vulnerability I mentioned earlier, like students have to be willing to be honest with us about why they're choosing to reach out to other sources. But if folks aren't already doing it, I think that's really important work to be done. And lastly, what I've come to learn from this work with Dr. Villeneuve is just that there's an incredibly large corpus of digitized material from the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Newspapers and printed books and political cartoons and all sorts of different things that librarians, libraries, and archivists are creating access to, and that we understand how to navigate those spaces. And this is such an important era in understanding our era now, an era of high immigration, of massive internal migrations, of complex cultural, social interactions. There are a lot of stories that didn't get told by the sort of majority narrative of American history that historians are reaching out to write now and to work on now. And if we can engage with scholars working on that kind of historical work, I think we can assist them, and I think that we can do a lot to help elevate voices into their hands that they can do some really thoughtful work with. And I'm sure that's my 10. So I'll step back, but I look forward to your questions.
That was incredible, James. It's amazing you have those three-pronged approach to expanding our knowledge of social justice and diversity in the library field. That's incredible. And um, it's also so invaluable that you've given us like tools, like with the why method, that can help us build our understanding of diversity in so many information contexts. So, Marco is next. Marco serves as an open education librarian and associate professor at the University of Idaho Library. He is also a co-creator of the Shikana por Mi Raza Digital Memory Collective, which collects and preserves imperiled histories of Shikana activism. His areas of expertise and scholarly practice include open education, digital humanities, and digital scholarship and archives. Marco was the author of a number of well-received scholarly book chapters and articles, perhaps most notably his 2020 article, "It's Not Just About the Cost: Academic Libraries and Intentionally Engaged OER for Social Justice," which was the first article in the discipline to connect contemporary open praxis to the long legacy of women of color feminist thought and action on education. Some very, very interesting stuff. So I'll now turn it over to Marco.
Thank you so much, Brett. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Sounds great. All right, Brett, you and me are going to be doing a lot of code driving on this one. So have your clicker finger ready. And I just wanted to say thank you so much to my fellow panelists, to ACRL for this opportunity, and also to my colleague, Jaleesa Kenyon, who was the person who specifically helped me get connected with this. Jaleesa's been an amazing colleague and a great example of an ally in practice in the way that she's really always looking and supporting me specifically, but also her other colleagues in connecting to opportunities like this. My talk today is Do Less Harm, Critically Engaged Librarianship. As mentioned, I'm Marco Seiferle Valencia. I am just tenured as of this year, so very excited about that. I'm at the University of Idaho Library. I've been here since 2018. And with that, we'll go to the next slide. Thank you, JJ. Thank you. The first slide that we have up is actually a land acknowledgement. So this is our U of I land and place acknowledgement. I'm joining you from Moscow, Idaho, which I'll show you where that is on a map in just a moment. And I'm actually pretty close to James. And this is a fun panel for me because James is just up the road from me, so to speak. And JJ and I were actually in the same class at the University of Michigan, the same year of information science school. So it's a cool intersection for me. So U of I Moscow is located on the homelands of the Nez Perce, the Palouse, and the Coeur d'Alene tribes. We extend gratitude to the indigenous people that call this place home since time immemorial. U of I recognizes that it is our academic responsibility to build relationships with the indigenous people to ensure integrity of tribal voices. And that's our University of Idaho land acknowledgement, which was written by Yolanda Bisbee, which is our executive tribal relations officer. And that's a photograph of the Palouse. This is a really unique landscape here. Some people call it the Tuscany of North America because we have this kind of very unique landscape that's only here. So that's a sort of a little sampler of what it looks like. Next slide, please, Brett. So this, I promised I'd show you where we are. So just to kind of do our place setting. And this sort of introduction is also a big part of my practice, right? So my research is deeply drawn from where I come from and where I am. And so a geographical understanding and a sort of historical understanding is a key part of how I establish that for myself. So Moscow, Idaho is not a big enough town to be on the map at this scale. Most of you are probably familiar with Seattle or Portland. We're about a 5-hour drive from either of those. And in this unique region called the Palouse, which includes parts of North Idaho, Washington, and arguably a part of that northeast corner of Oregon. Next slide, please. When I was moving out here from Michigan, people are saying I was moving to the middle of nowhere. And in some ways, it's a fair criticism. I sort of felt like I drove here and stopped in a wheat field. But the middle of nowhere is someone else's center of the universe, right? And so where we happen to be is the center of the Nez Perce universe. This actually shows the Nez Perce current reservation, as well as the original tribal lands that they were supposed to have. And then what they have basically been whittled down to is that kind of area in the middle. So this area is very familiar to me. It reminds me a lot of where I'm from, which is a place called Farmington, New Mexico. We'll go to the next slide for that one. And Farmington is similarly located to a large reservation trust. This is the Navajo Nation in the gray area here. Farmington's that little tiny red area. And this is an area in the Four Corners. So those 4 Southwest states were about an hour right away from that junction. And we'll go to the next slide. This area is super beautiful. Angels Peak, Shiprock, these are considered sacred sites for Navajo people in the region, and just absolutely beautiful areas. And so I grew up on a really rural property. We didn't have running water. We didn't have electricity for the first part of my life. And I'm not Navajo, but I went to a Navajo elementary school. So I'm Chicano, which I'll talk more about as we wind our way through this. But that also informed my identity, my understanding of sort of intersecting identities and the ways in which you can be sort of in a collective experience and also have your own identities that maybe don't align necessarily. So when I was a young child, I didn't understand Chicano as native, for instance, and now I do understand Chicano as a native identity, which has been a real blessing and gift, and partly something that's come through my academic work. So Brett, I'll have to go to the next slide. So one of the downsides of this area is there's a lot of environmental degradation and exploitation. And so this is the Four Corners Power Plant. It's the largest coal power plant. At one point in time, you could actually see it from space. It was a huge polluter. And this is actually where my dad worked. So he would hop in his truck and drive an hour and a half every morning to go and work here as a water analyst, and then eventually like a project planner. And it's actually, you can see Shiprock, that sacred site, in the background in this photo. And so this really just informs basically everything about me, right? I have this deep relationship with land. I'm interested in place and geography. And also I have had this direct experience of seeing all this environmental destruction, and myself, that property that I mentioned that I grew up on, we actually had water that had been fracked. And so I now have a number of autoimmune conditions that may or may not be related to that fracked water, right? So I've had these direct corporal experiences of environmental injustice. And this is all kind of the lens that I arrived to library school at. So with that, Brett, I'll have you go to the next one. So this is just a tiny little summary about me. As we mentioned in my little bio, I'm an open education librarian. So I'm an official liaison to the College of Education, and I'm also an advocate for open education on campus. So open pedagogy and reducing student courses. These institutions on the right are sort of my path to where I am now. These are all places where I held different positions in various libraries or collections there. And so I've been on a winding path to where I am now, but one that's really informed a lot of the work that I'm still doing. Next slide, please, Brett. So currently I define my research interest as, and I have to say opportunities like this are such a wonderful opportunity to reflect and to sort of be self-reflective about what you're doing and why you're doing it and how you describe and talk about it to other people. So thank you again for the opportunity. I don't know that I necessarily had all this handy before this, so this was a great practice for me. So I'm really interested in critical librarianship, especially coming through the lenses of women of color, feminism, disability justice, indigenous self-determination and sovereignty, and eco-critique. So those are all different lenses that I see present in my work and that I see a convergence as it develops. It's not necessarily that every piece has all of that, but I think every piece maybe centers that and then has elements of those other lenses coming in as well. And for me, I just feel like those are the lenses that I see the world through. Some of my areas of practice formally are open education, digital humanities, archives, and special collections. Also, this is a photo I took of the Snake River, which is just south of here, about 45 minutes. And I learned preparing for this, that flower is called balsam root and is an important food and medicine plant throughout the Western US. Brett, I'll have you go to the next one. So I mentioned women of color feminism several times. I only have 10 to 15 minutes here, so I'm going to not click into here. But if you're curious, Chicana por mi raza is a really great digital archiving effort. And this slide sort of encapsulates a top level view of what we do, which is basically we go to different Chicanas houses who have done these incredible activism, thought, scholarship, poetry, art, scholars, activists, politicians, educators, people from many, many stripes of life. But one of the things that they have in common is that they were all participating in the Chicana movement of the 1960s and 1970s in particular. And they have these incredible stories of their lives and their activism, as well as their creative product. And many of it it's just sitting in people's basements or attics, and it's imperiled histories that are at risk of being lost in a number of different ways, and also aren't sort of integrated into the broader topic of Chicano history. So one of the issues with Chicano history, in so much that it exists, is it's very male focused, and it tends to exclude the contributions of a lot of women in the movement and just historically. So what we do is we go on these trips to different places using typically undergraduate students as our core team, and we actually scan and do the archival collection. So this is a project I've been working on since 2012, and we're still actively collecting. We're now the largest collection of this kind in terms of specifically feminist Chicana focused materials. So if you're curious to learn more, I suggest you check out our Instagram. We've got so many great photos and trip sort of recaps, but also scans of the actual archive. And we've also started actually having our students put their bios and stuff on there, which is very cool. Okay, so moving on, next slide. No time to stay here, would love to talk about it more. Current project. So Chicana Parme Raza I mentioned, and we looked at, we're working on a current website redesign here, kind of a big deal. Our Drupal site is going away. So if any of those words mean anything to you, feel free to reach out to me for more conversation, because with the digital humanities, the sort of continuation of a project is part of the research or the praxis question. I've also been a part of this big Crabtree Lithics collection, which was a big effort to scan a flint knap collection of points in our library, which we can talk more about if people are interested. I actually had to figure out the process for 3D digitizing things in my house and then train someone remotely on that. So that was a really interesting sort of technical project. And I have some forthcoming work that's critical looks at things like traditional knowledge labels, a term that we're coining called pioneer veneration, which is really looking at how uncritical takes on pioneer history inform a lot of the work that we see in special collections and archives. Okay, so with that, I wanted to kind of deal directly with the questions here and not just talk entirely about myself specifically. So let's go ahead and move on to the next slide if we can. So I've already talked about this a little bit, but I want to just kind of tease out that for me, the main thing is I'm always looking for the intervention point in any library project or topic. This sort of contradicts what JJ said, which is to kind of set a focus and develop your expertise and really pull that in. I think I've done that, but I'm always looking for those different lenses in a project and in any particular project or topic we're thinking of. So if it's a group research project, I'm thinking about how might there be harm possible in what we're doing and how is there going to be benefit. And so what my kind of summary is that the work centers around acknowledging that there's always harm possible, even in seemingly innocuous activities, and also the possibility for profound benefit. One of our panelists who couldn't be here has done some really amazing work on the concept of vocational awe, and a lot of what I'm talking about here really takes that concept and extends it further, right? To think about, well, an innocuous activity, that's often that vocational awe thing. We often think of what libraries are doing as sort of unquestionably good. So for me, my goal is to think expansively about the possibilities, both negative and positive in any project, and then choose a path intentionally and deliberately that hopefully emphasizes those positives and minimizes those harms. Next slide, please, Brett. I think one of the questions we had was, what advice do we have for researchers who want to incorporate an EDI-related lens early on in their research? And my top level response is that if you're really serious about this, you need, especially at like a transformative level and not just a sort of line on your CV level, you really need to take the opportunity to educate yourself and be in a continued process of education on any of your own internal issues related to white fragility, implicit bias, ableism, and anti-Indigenous bias, and more, just to name a few. There's so many great tools out there nowadays, like the Harvard Implicit Bias Test. If you've never taken that, and you do one thing from this panel, that would just delight me. You know, go take that test and see where you have some implicit bias, and then work to actively counter that by seeking out content from experts in those fields and even people from your sort of aligned identities, and seeing like, okay, how do folks with my identities who have this bias work with it? There's a lot of great resources out there, but I think it's really important that people understand like this is a lifetime praxis. It's not just like a one and done. So the more we build our anti-racism chops, the more we see that it's a recurring praxis of knowledge that keeps expanding, and we're going to need to come back to. Brett, we're ready for the next one. And similarly, there's a question of what are some strategies for bringing intersectionality into EDI related research? And from my view, not having intersectionality is like watching a movie with half the screen cut off. Aren't you curious to see what's on the other half of the screen? Similarly, in research, I think when we don't thoroughly consider intersectionality in the work and in the even in our research questions, we bias our research outcomes. And so thinking about, well, how accurate can your view of that slide be if you're only looking at a half of it? So intersectionality in a broadly defined way, moving away from Crenshaw's original definition, which always must include Black Black woman's experience in particular. It's in some ways just a concurrent broader steps back until you see the bigger picture of everything that goes into a system, person, or experience. I personally think it's really important to continue to center the Black woman's experience in intersectionality, because I think much like in decolonization, we see conversations that don't center Native or Indigenous people. It's important that those terms that have those origins retain that representation in that origin. So while we might say we're thinking about intersectionality in a way that's not just about race, it's always really important that it comes back to and includes race and includes things like misogyny, especially when we listen to our Black women colleagues in librarianship and their experiences that they're having, which are often specifically informed by that intersectionality. With that, I'll go ahead and go to my next slide. In true librarian form, I wanted to leave a few resources here. And so, for instance, in Open, I've been inspired a lot by Indigenous thinking about Open. Kayla Larson's talk in particular about the 6 R's of Indigenous Open, just taking a standard in Open, which is the 5 R's, and saying, what does an Indigenous version look like? If you feel totally unresourced to start something like this, I really recommend that you think about hiring a consultant. I've included one person here, Mondo Vaden, who I've been lucky to do a lot of great work with lately. He is available as a consultant that you could actually hire, and is someone that could work with you personally or with the library, right? So maybe he's just someone you meet with once or twice a year and say, what's some cool topics on intersectionality and ways that I should be growing and educating myself, right? Like thinking expansively about how you keep sort of a finger on the pulse and keep learning as you go on this. This was a great little video from Kimberly Crenshaw, What is Intersectionality? It's 2 minutes long. I really enjoyed listening to it and hadn't come across it before. So just going back to the source is a great way to learn on these topics, and then going deeper. So We Here is a space for primarily librarians of color. Initially, it was a Facebook group, but they've now established a community school that's open to everyone that speaks on these topics. So lots of great resources out there. So with that, I'm definitely over on my time, but I will go ahead and pause there and say thank you so much for this opportunity to speak with you all, and I look forward to everyone's questions.
Marco, thank you so much. Heartfelt thanks. That was such a beautiful way of integrating storytelling with your research and the imagery. It's something I want my colleagues to see on the recording that we're making today too. That was magnificent.
Thank you, Brett. That's very kind of you.
Oh no, thank all 3 of y'all for joining us today. I feel like we've got the dream team of diversity in the library profession with us today. And now I think we're ready for the question and answer part of our session.
Thanks, Brett. So my name is Jody Borgerdine. I'm one of the co-chairs of the EBSS EDI committee, and I'm going to moderate our Q&A portion of our event today. So if you have questions for our panelists, please go ahead and type them into the chat. Please don't be shy or think, I don't know about my question. Yes, please feel free to pop it into the chat. But I do have a couple already kind of prepared to get our panelists going. And again, please post your questions into the chat. I'm keeping track of all of them, and we'll get to your question as soon as we can. So, JJ, James actually had a question for you that he had put in the chat. He would like for you to say a little bit about what libraries can be doing to improve accessibility to the research resources that we are creating.
So the number one easiest is that whenever we scan something, make sure it's OCR'd. And literally that is a ticky box. Right? It's a ticky box on the software. And when I say when we scan something, I don't just mean when we're scanning like a heritage collection and we're digitizing it. I also mean when we're doing scans for interlibrary loan. Because you don't know who is requesting that ILL. And again, literally, we're to the point where OCR is a ticky box. Why not just hit the ticky box and make everything OCR'd all the time? OCR is optical character recognition. And in the bad old day, PDFs were actually digital images. So think of like a camera photo. Literally, that's what they were. And those are not readable by a screen reader. You know, I'm very much I want to communicate with people, so I like blew up the chat with all sorts of stuff, including, you know, random commentary from my brain. But one of the things I threw in there's a really great column article by Arlich called "My User is a Machine." And in that article, he makes a beautiful argument about why our handouts, our PDFs, our PowerPoints, all of that should be accessible and machine readable. And it's not just for screen readers, right? It's so that you can do a large language model analysis of a big corpus of work, right? Which you can't do if all those PDFs are images. So depending on how old the material is, and when it was scanned, you know, unfortunately, you might have to go back and redo, right? Which is like, you know, this is why we hire undergraduate students, right? So yeah, but I mean, we really should be thinking about accessibility much more often than we do. You know, Marco mentioned, you know, we're redesigning a website and moving away from Drupal. And you know, my immediate knee-jerk reaction was, are you thinking about accessibility as you're rebuilding? You know, are you testing for compliance with WCAG, and all that kind of stuff, right? So, you know, there's a lot of reasons why to do this work. And, you know, a chunk of them, if you need a really strong stick, is legal. I mean, you can get sued if your resources are not accessible. And, you know, we've seen that in a landmark case of Pion versus LACCD. There you go, that's in the chat. And that's a great case because it really shows us how the standard has been very slipshod for people with disabilities. You know, and going back to ADA compliance versus accessibility, we should be making it accessible. It's not that much more of a push to make things accessible. So I will jump off my soapbox, but I'm happy to answer more questions.
Thanks, JJ.
Thank you.
For our panelists, feel free for someone to jump in. I was wondering if you could offer a little advice about how to navigate the research that you are doing institutionally when some of your colleagues may feel targeted or threatened by the findings that you are producing?
Um, I'll take a stab, and then I would say I'd pass it off to Marco, because he's probably a really good contrast to me. So with my own neurodiversity, I have complex post-traumatic stress disorder, which does fall under the umbrella of neurodiversity. And that's important to say because we often use the term neurodiversity as a synonym for autism, and it's not. Even though autism is under that umbrella. So, you know, my neurodiversity mishigas meant that I like really stomped on toes. I absolutely made a mess, and did not realize how much of a mess I was making. So even though I had this or have this huge body of work, that's really important, like, and is getting lots of attention. Some of my pieces have been cited over 100 times already, and they're only like 5 years old. That's a really big deal in library land, right? You know, most of the time you publish something and you're like, is anybody out there? Did anybody read this? And you're like, I'm just gonna throw this into the ether. And so what I learned was really, you know, tenure is about a combination of things. Part of it is the work that you produce, but there's also this hidden part called collegiality. And especially in the disability world, we know that collegiality is code word for we don't want you, right? Or you need to be like us in order to fit in. And so, you know, again, because of my own disability and disabilities, plural, I didn't really understand that I was mashing toes. I was focused on results. Let's, you know, get a handrail installed here. Let's get better signage. Let's make this building more accessible. Just because it wasn't before doesn't mean it can't be now. And I'm not making judgment about why it never happened. Let's just fix it. That was my attitude, but that was not the perception that was received. The perception was JJ's judging us. JJ is mean to us. JJ, you know, is making fun of us, I think is what those perceptions were. And you know, the price was I didn't get tenure and I still don't have a job. You know, as a person with disabilities, I'm to the point where I really need to work from home, because of the constellation of disabilities I have. And all of that work has dried up, you know, and it's dried up because of ableism, right? I mean, the last 3 years of my job, I did it all from home and it wasn't a problem. But I can't get a kind of job that I had because everybody's demanding return to work, right? Return to the building. So when I talk about the profession being ableist, this is an example of that, right? I can't get a job because I'm more disabled and no one's willing to accept that accommodation. So, you know, at this point, I'm exiting the profession, even though I don't want to. It sucks. Okay, Marco, your turn.
Just want to leave some space, take an empathetic pause on that and acknowledge, you know, that JJ. JJ, you and I should have an offline chat. I'm sort of struggling with how to answer this question without sort of being overly personal. You know, James, I think at my level, I have taken a real sort of overextension at the risk of burnout approach. And so I have a lot of research and a lot of buckets. And I am at an institution that is a publisher parish, tenure track, or you're immediately fired type of place. And Moscow's in North Idaho. I am openly transgender. I am brown. I am disabled. I am the only person in my library who works remotely. So it's a very interesting position that I'm in, and one that's fraught. And so part of the way that I dealt with that was by putting together a sort of inassailable packet that also included a lot of research that's not DEI focused. That's not my digital archiving work. And so it's sort of like the path has been a sort of safety in having a lot of norm core projects. And I don't mean any disrespect to those projects, but they're just your standard. We're doing a research support services study to see how people are using data in our library. And there is not really a meaningful EDI component into that work. And I would say at any given time, I have sort of 2 tracks of research going. And one is the stuff that is what my library wants and needs. And it is not very EDI focused. I mean, it's just not. And then there's the stuff that I'm doing, which I feel like is about the sort of practice I have of engaged Buddhism that's asked me to look deeper in my work for what am I doing? Like, why am I doing this? And so for me, the survival point has been the balance in between those 2 things. And I think to sort of JJ's speak to some of the points that he raises, it's partly those norm core projects that keep me in collaboration and collegiality with a broader group of people. And it's also allowed me to find the folks who are willing to sort of do the edgier stuff. So, I've definitely taken the sort of tenure track approach of I'm getting more risky, I guess you might say, more controversial, saying more directly what I think in my research as I go, instead of sort of starting right at the start. And I will say at the start of it, I sort of felt like this is selling out, because I know how, pardon my language, but I know how effed up these places are, and I should be in here saying what's wrong with it and articulating my experiences. I've started this job in 2018, but I'd worked in libraries for 15 years before, and had done a gender transition in libraries. And so I've left libraries because I was being harassed so horribly. So it's like I definitely have a real sense of what's wrong with these places. And also I think the experience of being a minority in a library is also very different. And the sort of skill of like, well, maybe you don't necessarily really say what you think that much of the time, and you have to translate what you think in a way to make it acceptable to people. I think that's something that I've heard a lot of my fellow BIPOC librarians talk about. So I think I'll also just kind of wrap this up and say that I feel like I got really lucky with my particular institution at U of Idaho. On paper, Idaho is not a place that I would have thought would be such a great home for me, but there is a genuine practice of collegiality here that I didn't experience, for instance, at some of my other institutions. And so I think that that's helped a lot. So James, I don't know. And also I'd be kind of curious to ask you this question back, which is like, have you encountered that in any of your work, and what's kind of your response?
That's a great question. Gosh. I just want to acknowledge the work that both of you do is so incredibly vital. I am not a person who has many marginalized experiences, but I'll add that there is an element of my identity that is marginalized, and I have never been brave enough to do research in that area. And there is a real courage that both of you exhibit that I don't know, I'm moved by. I think there are a couple of elements here. Thank you for asking the question back, Marco. I think that one of the ways in which my work has avoided rocking boats is just my identity, right? When the white cishet guy says, let's do some research on EDI, I don't get tagged in the same way that other people do. Folks in the audience, we got to use what we've got to help make this work happen. And so that's a piece, I think. The other thing I will say is that, I think there is what both of your experiences allude to, right, is the immediacy of threat. People will feel in circumstances where this is not about threat, this is about growth. This is about learning and doing better. But I will say, like, there were times, especially in the research on source evaluation, where we knew that we were researching the work of composition instructors. These folks are often themselves in pretty tough situations. They're grad students, they're adjuncts. It was important not to do that research in a way that made them feel threatened, because there was threat to them, right, in terms of the kind of conclusions we might reach. And so doing thoughtful research design in a way that reassures people that, especially people who are in states of vulnerability, that their participation in that research is going to be to their benefit and not to their harm. And not just a, I trust you, it's not going to harm me, but like, I have designed this so that it won't harm you, I think is really important, because trust can be flimsy. And we don't always have control over all the ways our data is going to get used. And so I think being really thoughtful about how we structure our work, I think, is an important piece of this too.
I would add to that. I mean, James brings up a fantastic point. I guard my data like a dragon on its hoard. Because I'm talking with people who have disabilities, right? We are super vulnerable, especially if you've hidden your disabilities to the point where like no one can tell, and you're terrified of coming out at work. You know, I have conversations every semester with people about, oh, should I get an accommodation? I feel like I really, really need one, but, and I'm like, only you can make that decision. And you have to do a risk benefit analysis about, you know, how much harm is going to happen to you if you ask for an accommodation. Should I ever be having that conversation? No. And yet we're in a society where I have to have that conversation with people. And so, yeah, I mean, like my data, you know, in some of the places I've published, they really want the data in a repository. And I'm like, no. I mean, if it's a decision between publishing with you and putting my data in a repository and publishing with someone else, I'm going to go to someone else, because I will protect my participants until the end of time. I mean, we're already so beaten up that I just can't in good conscience make my data available. So yeah, and preventing harm on the front end as much as possible, but also understanding, at least in my work, sometimes there's no way to prevent that harm. If we want to know how bad it is for people with disabilities in the profession, then, you know, we're gonna get re-traumatized, right? We're gonna have to have those conversations about the traumas we've experienced and why those traumas happened, in order to understand how do we make sure it doesn't keep happening. It's a lot.
Yeah, JJ, as you were speaking, something that made me think of is, you know, so much of how well that HR accommodation process goes boils down to what your HR department is like, but also what you as a potential manager in a library setting is like. And so again, in trying to think of like the point of intervention, you know, I would really encourage managers on this call or people with any degree of authority over someone in your library to think about that intersectionality piece, and to look, for instance, like Caswell's White Supremacy in the Archive, or even going further back and looking at like the invisible knapsack of white supremacy, and looking in particular for those white supremacy and workplace norms, right? So for instance, we feel arriving on time is just a thing that you do if you respect your job and you respect your colleagues. And so, you know, who here has not been frustrated with students who have not shown up to meetings on time, and you're like, oh, they should know, they should get this. And it's like, do you as a manager have it in your brain to say, I wonder if there's an access issue happening? I wonder if there's a disability issue happening. Also, is it really that important that this meeting starts at 9? Should I maybe just make small talk for 5 minutes to ease people in so that if someone's 5 minutes late, it's not a big deal? These are the things that we take for granted in library culture as good things, our sort of normativity and our adherence to a sort of business-like culture. But there's quite a bit of harm built into those types of systems. And so really asking, are some of these things that I take for granted as an unqualified good, like timeliness or particular ways of speaking, or even particular ways of writing, or particular ways of engaging projects? And how can I actively educate myself about how different disabilities manifest, and also how am I putting my own sort of, often in a library, white cultural bias onto this picture? And sometimes I see people go the other way and then say crazy things like, oh, well, Native people can't be on time because they're Native and they don't believe in time. And it's like, okay, now you've swung too far in the other direction and you're going into a stereotype and a sort of caricature of experience. And so really, I would suggest that people look, just Google like white supremacy in business culture and white supremacy in library culture, and look for how that manifests in your library. Because I think there's a lot of people on here who would say, I wouldn't want to cause this type of harm. I don't want to be ableist. I don't want to be racist. And then you have to actually look at what's happened at work and in the practice and be like, oh, well, is that thing that I think is just enforcing a normal work rule actually one of those practices, and I don't even realize it? And I think that's where the real transformative potential is, and also where we start to have managers who are more open to accommodating folks in ways that work for everyone. It's still working for the library. If I can take the opportunity while I'm talking to ask a question, JJ, you mentioned sort of seeing more disabilities, more disabled librarians, more librarians with disabilities, however you want to frame it. And your quote in the chat too is noted about 30% of Americans have disability, but only 3% of librarians are identifying that way. I sort of feel like disability is actually overly represented in librarianship in terms of a lot of people having it, but people are not willing to talk about it. And so I guess my two questions are, does that map for you? I partly have questions like, are our buildings making us sick? Like, why does everyone have so many quasi autoimmune disease type symptoms? Like, what's going on with that? And secondly, do you think that there's any connection / I guess expansion point with looking at with long COVID and sort of the mass disabling effect of that, and how librarians are so frequently exposed to COVID? So just any thoughts that you have on that, I'd love to hear. And James as well too, but it's off of JJ's question. So
I actually want to piggyback on your last comments first, which is, you were talking about like the white supremacy in the library, thinking about how that is in our research, right? We have white, we have Black, we have Hispanic, we have, white, non-Hispanic, blah, blah, blah. How often do you see biracial? Right? How often do you see more than 2 genders? Is it, male, female, and other, right? How often do you see a question that tries to get at, are you a first generation student? That deliberately asks that question of, did your parents go to college? And the answer is that a lot of times we don't ask those questions. We don't ask those questions of our students or of our participants. We don't ask those questions of each other. So how do we really know what the demographics of the profession actually are? That little statistical quote, the ALA demographic surveys from 2017, so it's terribly out of date now. But of the people that took that survey, only 3% identified as having disability. And in my experience, you are absolutely correct, Marco, in terms of the profession actually attracts, I think, a lot more people with disabilities, especially because this profession has, the front of the house and the back of the house, right? The front of the house is, for us introverts, or for us extroverts who want to work with students and researchers and stuff like that. And the back of the house is going to be the acquisitions, the cataloging, the behind the scenes stuff that keeps the library going. And those require completely different skill sets, and are also attractive to different people with different types of disabilities. Also, the very nature of disability has changed. I was talking to, so a little bit of a story here. My mother died in May. She was a football person. Not like, ooh, rah, super fan. Not like that. But she watched football often. And, this is the first holiday season without her. And so I'm like, you know what? I'm going to commit to watching football in honor of her this season. And I like football. I wasn't a watcher as much as she was. And I cannot for the life of me remember which team, but a kicker for one of the teams from last weekend, he came on the field and I immediately spotted the glucose monitor taped to his tricep. And I know what that thing is, right? I know what that device is. That and to what, for me, it immediately signaled this man has diabetes type 1. This man is disabled. And he's a professional football player. And I was like, that's cool, right? That is awesome. I like seeing that. 10 years ago, that glucose monitor barely existed. He wouldn't have been wearing it on the field. It was still too fragile, right? And I never would have known that that kicker has a disability unless he chose to reveal it in, some media interview. So more and more, certain types of disabilities are becoming more visible and or more talked about. There's more willingness to talk about mental health issues like depression, anxiety, ADD. I know like at least a dozen women who have been diagnosed with ADD in their 40s and 50s. And they're like, wow, this has been a game changer. Being on ADD medication, I can focus, I can get things done. Why wasn't I diagnosed as a teenager? So all of that is huge, right? And I love that you pointed out the mass disabling event of COVID, because it is a mass disabling event. The CDC numbers, before COVID were like 23%. And after COVID, they're now actually like, I think the number is actually 27%. I usually just round up to 30 to make math easy because I suck at math. But it's now like 27%. And that number is only going to keep on increasing, especially as more people continue to be exposed to COVID. Why is that a big deal? Because we don't know really the damage that COVID does long term and with multiple exposures. So people only think about like, oh, my symptoms were super mild because I got vaccinated, but you still had it. That virus still got into your body and has damaged your heart, your lungs, your brain, and a whole bunch of other stuff. Anytime you see somebody under the age of 50 dying and they're like, suddenly died, I'm willing to bet there's a very good chance it's COVID complications. Because that's what COVID does. It affects people unilaterally in a way that makes it hard for companies and employers to understand what that person needs. I mean, how well does a boss understand that I've had COVID and now I'm so fatigued, I literally cannot keep my eyes open from 2 to 4, and I need to like take a nap for 2 hours. Now, that's not true for me. I've never had COVID. knock wood. But I've been extremely militant about staying away from people. Like, I have a big fat body. This big fat body is a reservoir for COVID. If I get COVID, I make my living off my brain. My body is broken. If COVID takes out my brain, that's it. I don't know how I would survive. I wouldn't. And I think librarianship is not talking about that enough, right? We saw a huge wave of retirements with COVID because employers were demanding that people continue working even when it put their health at risk because of those autoimmune diseases, right? Because they had cancer and they really needed to not be exposed to COVID. I think there's also something totally to be said about your comment about, why do so many librarians who have worked in the same building for 40 years have cancer? That's a real thing. Has there been any research on that? Not that I've seen, but I'd love to see some statistics. Because I think, it's probably higher than the national average. So yeah, I think the work environment we have physically and the human factor absolutely negatively affects people with disabilities. The good news is that there's more interest in the topic. There's more interest in, students in iSchool or in library schools talking about this stuff. I teach the disability class for Syracuse University, and that's really weird, right? Because that class is one of the only ones in the country. There's only 4 schools that have a disability course. Otherwise, disability is looped into like diversity population course or something like that. Which, when that happens, it does a disservice to different minority populations, especially when we think about how do we serve those populations? How do we research those populations? And how do we know what those populations really need? It's, there's been a really wonderful, meme going around like on Facebook and stuff of in public libraries, you have parents sitting in front of a computer and there's like a designated playpen right next to them. So they can work on the computer and put baby in the playpen. And they don't have to like haul in a pack and play, right? That's a great research area. How are parents using the library? Go a step further. How are parents using the academic library? How are we supporting 18, 19-year-old parents at a major university? The answer is we're not, right? We're not providing a maternity room, right, or a lactation room. We're not providing space for them to bring their child or their cousin or their nephew or niece because they're a caretaker of a child. We have this presumption of who our students are, and that presumption is no longer true, right? And that's also true for us. Who the librarian is has changed. We're now more disabled. I think we're more aware of the issues, especially DEI. And, we're also more likely to speak up if we're asked to do so. A lot of us are also working in toxic environments. And we're struggling with, do I stay in the profession or do I leave? Is this going to get better? I love the profession, but this is crushing my soul.
We just have a few minutes left, about 5 minutes. And I know, Marco, you had posed a question to James, but I want to, we had a question from one of the attendees that I do want to get to for just the last few minutes. how do you view the future of EDI research and scholarship given the current policy environment and backlash against DEI in higher ed?
Just going to jump in on that one real quick because I'm in Idaho. It's definitely a challenging environment. I've been uninvited from keynoting things in the state because I had social justice in the title. Like it's a challenging place. I think the political environment is part of the reason why it's important that EDI is not an auxiliary thing, but is embedded in the work from the beginning and is less about the branding and the sort of superficial appearance of it and more about the deep motivations of the work. And so my sort of 30-second thing would be, you know, they can come and close your Office of Multicultural Affairs, but it's a lot harder to get in there and stop you from doing really good research that actually serves students of color. And so it's actually now on us more than ever to make this be real impactful stuff that we do and not just like, well, there's a center and I can send my gay kids over there and I don't really worry about them. It's like, no, those students are all of our students. They belong to all of us. We belong to them in terms of this sort of environment and our responsibility. And it's like, how do you have EDI so embedded in your work that it's impossible to pull it out? That's I think the response if you're in a red state or other conservative place. And James, I would love to give you some airtime on that and other thoughts you might have.
I mean, I'm a short drive from you, Marco, but it is a different world. I'm so glad you spoke on that. I think the one piece that I would drop here, and it tacks on a little bit too to what JJ was just talking about, because Marco, you posed the question about this gap between the number of librarians who will represent themselves or identify themselves as disabled and what we know that the proportion must be. I think it goes back to what I mentioned earlier about research teams and vulnerability. We don't have library spaces in which people feel that it's safe to be vulnerable about these things. And so I think it's incumbent on us to not just make those spaces in our research communities, which are great, but we have to work within our library community to make those spaces happen. And I think that if we create spaces like that within the library, we can have the kind of conversation you're talking about, Marco, where we say, okay, maybe we can't use this hot button word or this phrase or something because, some member of the board of trustees is going to, come unhinged. But like, what's the work we need to be doing? And where are all the places where this touches the work that we do that we can be engaged with it? I think that's hard to do. And I think it's going to take collective effort from a lot of librarians who aren't on calls like this, who don't think of this as their work, who didn't think they went to library school to do this work. I don't know. We just got to start to elevate the profession here and say, folks, whether or not you think this is your work, this is your work, and it's going to be your work for the rest of your career. And how are we going to do it together? That's my thought.
Yeah, James, that makes me think about that role of managers, right? That it's partly as we ascend as managers in our organization, we get to sort of help set those norms too. Sorry to cut you off there, Jody.
You're fine, Marco. We are right at time. I'm going to pass it over to Thomas, who's going to close us out.
Hi, everyone. I'm Thomas. I'm the chair of the EBSS Research Committee. I wanted to thank all of our panelists for their insightful look at the inclusive research practices and this very stimulating discussion we've had for the past little bit here. So thank you all for agreeing to come here and talk to us about your research. I also want to thank all of our attendees, the EDI committee and the research committee. Really thank you for coming and supporting the work that we're doing here. This was the first time we've co-hosted a panel, so we really thank you for coming and supporting the panel and our panelists. We are hoping to do more things like this, so be on the lookout for more communications from each of us individually, our committees individually, to learn more about this project. And we really want to continue to encourage you to be thinking about how to do inclusive research practices in your own areas and your own places of work. So thank you all.
Thank you. Okay, Eloise, do you need to do anything to close us out?
Just stop the recording.
All right. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for attending, and we will see you soon at a future EBSS event. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.